The question hit like a thunderclap. What if one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history finally said something he was never supposed to say out loud? Not in a courtroom, not in an interview, not under oath. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But in a private moment, when the cameras were gone and the walls felt safe. At 64 years old, after years of silence, denials, and carefully rehearsed distance, Prince Andrew is alleged to have made a remark so explosive that those who heard it say the room went cold instantly. Not because it confirmed anything, but because it raised a question no one wanted to answer. Why now? Why speak at all? And why about her? For years, Meghan Markle's name has existed at the center of endless controversy, speculation, loyalty battles, and whispered claims. Some defend her fiercely, others accuse her relentlessly. But until recently, there was one corner of the royal rumor mill that stayed strangely quiet. Not denied, not confirmed, just ignored. And that silence may be the most revealing detail of all. Here's what makes this moment different. According to multiple accounts, this wasn't a planned revelation. It wasn't leaked strategically. It wasn't crafted for public consumption. It was allegedly spoken casually, almost carelessly, as if the speaker believed the past was buried deep enough to stay there. But history has a way of resurfacing at the worst possible moment. Ask yourself this. Have you ever watched someone say too much because they believed no one was listening? Because they thought the story had already been written? Because they assumed the damage was already done? That's the moment we're talking about here. This story isn't about proving anything. It's about timing, about power, about silence breaking in ways no one can control, and about how a single sentence, spoken in confidence, can unravel years of carefully maintained distance. What makes this especially unsettling is not the claim itself, but the reaction that allegedly followed. Sudden discomfort, abrupt topic changes, a noticeable shift in tone, and later, a wave of indirect denials that never quite addressed the original remark. Why respond so fast to something that supposedly never mattered? Why does this story keep resurfacing despite the absence of evidence? And why do the people closest to the situation appear far more nervous than the public ever was? Before we explore what was allegedly said and how those words traveled beyond the room they were spoken in, there's something you need to understand first. This connection didn't begin with scandal. It began with proximity. And what happened next would change the way people interpreted years of royal silence, in ways no one saw coming. People assume scandals begin with explosions. They don't. They begin quietly, in hallways, at dinners, in rooms where names overlap not because of intention, but because of proximity. Before anyone whispered, before anyone denied, before anyone panicked, there was access. That's the part most people miss. Royal life is not a straight line of public appearances and press releases. It's a maze of private events, informal gatherings, shared circles, and unremarkable moments that never make headlines. People pass through the same spaces, sit at the same tables, exchange pleasantries that mean nothing until years later, when everything suddenly does. And this is where the story really begins. Not with a scandal, not with a claim, but with an overlooked overlap that no one thought to examine too closely. At the time, it seemed insignificant, almost boring. Another face in another room, another name in a crowded orbit of influence and access. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious, at least not on the surface. But ask yourself this. How many major controversies started because people assumed certain paths never crossed? Because it felt impolite to ask? Because no one wanted to look like they were reaching? That's what makes this connection so uncomfortable in hindsight. It wasn't hidden. It was simply unexamined. Those who later reflected on it described something strange. Not secrecy exactly, more like familiarity without documentation. Casual comfort, the kind that doesn't register as important until the context changes years later. And when the context did change, people began revisiting old moments with new eyes. Suddenly, small details felt heavier. A comment that once sounded harmless. A shared laugh remembered too clearly. A remark that didn't age well. Here's the contradiction that fuels everything. If nothing ever happened, then why did so many people later struggle to explain what they remembered? And if something did happen, why did no one talk about it at the time? This is where human psychology comes in. When something feels inconvenient rather than dangerous, people often choose not to see it. They minimize, rationalize, assume it's not their business, especially when powerful names are involved. Especially when questioning it could create problems they don't want. Think about it. How many times have you ignored a strange detail in your own life because confronting it felt like more trouble than it was worth? Now multiply that instinct by titles, institutions, and reputations that depend on silence. That's the environment this alleged connection existed in. Not secrecy enforced by locks and threats, but silence maintained by discomfort and disbelief. And here's the part that raises eyebrows. Years later, when questions finally surfaced, the reactions weren't calm. They weren't amused. They weren't dismissive in the way false rumors often are. They were tense, defensive, almost rehearsed. Why prepare answers for questions no one was asking yet? Why shut down conversations before they fully began? And why, according to some accounts, did one offhand comment suddenly trigger so much behind-the-scenes movement? Because someone finally asked the wrong question at the wrong time. And the answer they received wasn't the one they expected. But what allegedly came out next wasn't a full story. It was just enough to change the temperature in the room. And once those words were spoken, there was no taking them back. Because the silence that followed said more than any denial ever could. And that's where things started to unravel, fast. Here's the next section, continuing directly from that unraveling moment. Have you ever watched a room change temperature instantly? Not because someone raised their voice. Not because an argument broke out, but because a single sentence landed and nobody knew what to do with it. That's how this moment has been described by those who later spoke about it. Not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong. Wrong in timing, wrong in tone, wrong in implication. According to accounts that surfaced later, the comment wasn't delivered like a confession. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't even framed as important. That's what made it so unsettling. It allegedly came out casually, almost dismissively, as if referencing something so far in the past that it no longer mattered. But here's the contradiction. If it didn't matter, why did everything stop? Why did the conversation derail? Why did people suddenly become very aware of who was in the room? Those who claim to have been present describe a pause that lasted just a second too long. A glance exchanged that wasn't meant to be noticed. Someone clearing their throat. Another person changing the subject too quickly. Have you ever been in a moment where everyone pretends nothing happened, but you can feel that something absolutely did? That's the moment we're talking about. What followed wasn't outrage. It wasn't confrontation. It was silence. A silence that felt deliberate, protective, strategic. And silence, in situations like this, is rarely accidental. Here's where the psychology gets uncomfortable. People don't panic over lies the way they panic over truths spoken at the wrong time. Lies are easier to dismiss. Truths, even partial ones, create risk, especially when they don't come with context, proof, or explanation. And that's exactly what made this alleged remark so destabilizing. It didn't explain anything. It didn't clarify timelines. It didn't offer justification. It simply existed, floating in the air, unchallenged, unresolved. Ask yourself this. If someone you trusted said something completely untrue about a situation that could damage multiple reputations, wouldn't you shut it down immediately? So why didn't anyone? Instead, according to later accounts, the response came afterward, quietly, indirectly, through behavior changes rather than words. Distance, coldness, a sudden reluctance to revisit past overlaps. And then came the denials. Not direct ones, not forceful ones, but carefully worded statements that addressed everything except the sentence that allegedly caused the tension in the first place. Why deny the edges and not the center? Why correct tone instead of content? That's when observers began connecting dots they hadn't bothered to connect before, revisiting timelines, replaying interactions, wondering whether they had misunderstood earlier moments or ignored signs that didn't fit the narrative they were comfortable with. And here's the most unsettling part. Once a story like this enters the bloodstream, it doesn't need proof to survive. It feeds on reaction, on avoidance, on the instinct to control damage rather than confront discomfort. Because at that point, it's no longer about what was said. It's about why everyone reacted the way they did. And that reaction triggered something far bigger than anyone anticipated. Because while one person may have spoken too freely, others were already preparing to make sure that was the last time it ever happened. But what happened behind the scenes after that moment is where the real panic began. And that's where the story takes a turn no one expected. Continuing directly from that turn, here's where things stopped being accidental. Because once that moment passed, once the sentence existed in the world, the machinery kicked in. Quietly at first. No public statements. No dramatic rebuttals. No visible outrage. Just movement. People who had always been reachable suddenly weren't. Invitations changed. Conversations shortened. Long-standing routines were adjusted without explanation. And to outsiders, it looked like nothing at all. But insiders noticed. Have you ever seen panic disguised as calm? That's what this phase looked like. Not chaos, but control. The kind of control that only appears when someone believes a situation could spiral if left alone. According to later recollections, there was a subtle but unmistakable shift in tone among those closest to the situation. The subject was avoided with almost surgical precision. Names that had once been spoken casually were now treated like hazards. And any attempt to revisit past overlaps was gently, firmly redirected. Why work so hard to close a door no one was knocking on? That question started circulating quietly. Not publicly. Not online. In private conversations where people tested the waters carefully, unsure who was safe to speak to. And then came the contradictions. On one hand, there were assurances that nothing had ever happened, that the rumors were baseless, that the entire notion was absurd. On the other hand, there was an unmistakable effort to ensure the topic never resurfaced in the wrong setting. If something is truly false, why not let it burn itself out? Why manage it? This is where reputation management becomes more revealing than any statement ever could. Because institutions don't mobilize over gossip alone. They mobilize over risk, over unpredictability, over the fear that one loose thread could unravel far more than intended. And here's the twist most people miss. The alleged remark wasn't dangerous because of what it implied. It was dangerous because of who said it. Age, status, history. A pattern of past missteps that made even casual comments carry weight. When someone with that background speaks without filters, people don't hear jokes or exaggeration. They hear liability. That's when the narrative shifted from confusion to containment. Suddenly, unrelated stories were amplified. New headlines dominated attention. The news cycle moved on, not naturally, but forcefully, as if someone had pressed fast forward. Coincidence? Maybe. But when multiple distractions arrive at once, it's worth asking who benefits from the noise. And then there's the most unsettling detail of all. Those who later tried to revisit the moment say they were discouraged. Not threatened. Not warned. Just advised. As if remembering too clearly was somehow impolite. Have you ever been made to feel that asking a question was the real problem? That's the atmosphere that settled in. Because once control replaces clarity, the truth becomes less important than stability. And stability, in environments like this, often comes at the cost of transparency. But suppression has a flaw. It creates pressure, and pressure eventually finds an outlet. Because while some people were trying to bury the moment, others were beginning to realize just how much had been left unexplained. And one of them, according to accounts, decided not to stay quiet anymore. What that person did next would shift this story from whispers to something far more dangerous. Picking up directly from that pressure point. Here's the thing about silence. It works until it doesn't. Because the more tightly a story is contained, the more power it gains over the people trying to control it. And according to accounts from those on the periphery, that pressure finally found a release through someone no one was watching closely enough. Not a whistleblower. Not a journalist. Not someone chasing attention. Just a person who had heard enough to start asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. Have you ever noticed how stories don't usually break because of proof, but because someone refuses to play along with the pretending? That's what allegedly happened next. Conversations that had once been vague suddenly became specific. Dates were questioned. Locations were reconsidered. Casual remarks that had been brushed aside years earlier were pulled back into focus, not as evidence, but as context. And context is dangerous, because context turns denials into puzzles. This person didn't accuse anyone of anything. That's the crucial detail. They simply asked for clarity. Repeatedly. Calmly. Privately. And according to later recollections, those requests were met with an odd mix of reassurance and resistance. Reassurance that nothing happened. Resistance to explaining why nothing happened. Why does that matter? Because when the truth is simple, Explanations usually are too. Instead, what followed were layered responses, partial answers, gentle redirections, statements that felt complete until you listened closely and realized they answered a different question entirely. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you were told something, but learned nothing? That's the feeling described here. And here's where the emotional tone shifted. The situation stopped being about protecting reputations and started being about protecting consistency. Because once people began comparing notes, quietly and formally, they noticed something unsettling. The stories didn't match. Not dramatically, not enough to cause a public contradiction, just enough to create discomfort. Small differences in recollection, slight variations in emphasis. A detail remembered by one person that another insisted never existed. On their own, these things mean nothing. Together, they form cracks. And cracks don't stay small when pressure builds. This is the moment where fear quietly enters the room. Not fear of exposure, but fear of unpredictability. Because no one knew who might remember what next, or how many people might start revisiting moments they'd lost.